that traveling had changed warfare forever. Traveling and blossoms of fire and so much more. That blood price would still be paid, yet stone walls and high towers could no longer hold back an assault. The Ashaman had made the stone as obsolete as the bronze swords and stone axes men had often been reduced to in the breaking. Mankind's oldest stronghold was now a relic. The bond with Alana led him up until he came to tall, polished doors with golden leopards for door handles. She was on the other side. Light, but his stomach wanted to empty itself. Hardening himself, he pulled open one of the doors and went in, leaving the maidens to stand guard. Min and the others followed him in. The sitting room was almost as ornate as his own apartments in the stone. The walls hung with broad silk tapestries, showing scenes of the hunt and battle. The large patterned Tarabana carpet on the floor, worth sufficient gold to feed a large village for a year. The black marble fireplace tall enough for a man to walk into, and wide enough to hold 8 abreast. Every
Hey,
piece
Mace,
of
how you doing, bro?
all massively made, was elaborately carved,
How's your evening
crusted
going?
with gilt and dotted with gems, as were the tall golden stand lamps, their mirrored flames adding to the light let in by the glass-paned ceiling. A golden bear with ruby eyes and silver claws and teeth, more than a pace high, stood atop a gilded plinth on one side of the room, while an identical plinth held an emerald-eyed, ruby-taloned eagle nearly as tall. Restraint pieces for Tyr. Seated in an armchair, Alana looked up as he walked in and held out a golden goblet.
About the same, just chilling, about to
gold to fill with
spark up a bowl
tall golden pitcher
that I topped with some,
slender in a gray riding
that
dress,
threw some wax over the top of.
Alana was beautiful enough that Lews Therin began
I can't complain.
himself. Rand almost thumbed his earlobe before snatching his hand down, suddenly unsure whether that gesture was his or the madman's. She smiled, but darkly, and as her eyes swept across Min and Nynaeve, Olivia and Cadsuane, the bond carried her suspicion, not to mention anger and sulkiness. The last two heightened for Cadsuane. And there was joy as well, mixed in all the rest, when her gaze touched him. Not that it showed in her voice. "Why, who would have expected you, my Lord Dragon?" she murmured, with a hint of asperity in the title. "What a surprise, wouldn't you say, my Lord Asterin?" So she had not warned anyone after all. Interesting. "A very pleasant surprise," an elderly man in a coat with red and blue striped sleeves said as he rose to bow, stroking his oiled beard, trimmed to a point. The High Lord Astral Damara's face was creased, the hair that hung to his shoulders snow-white and thinning, but his back was straight and his dark eyes sharp. "I've been looking forward to this day for some time." He bowed again to Cadsuane and after a moment to Nynaeve. "Aes Sedai," he said, very civil for Tyr, where channeling, if not Aes Sedai themselves, had been outlawed before Rand altered the law. Darlin Cisnera, High Lord and Steward in Tyr for the Dragon Reborn, in a green silk coat with yellow striped sleeves and gold-worked boots, was less than a head shorter than Rand, with close-cut hair and a pointed beard, a bold nose and blue eyes that were rare in Tyr. Those eyes widened as he turned from a conversation with Caroline Damodred near the fireplace. The Carianan noblewoman gave Rand a jolt, though he had expected to see her here. The litany he used to forge his soul in fire almost started up in his head before he could stop it. Short and slim and pale, with large dark eyes and a small ruby dangling onto her forehead from a golden chain, woven into the black hair falling in waves to her shoulders, she was the very image of her cousin Moiraine. Of all things, she wore a long blue coat embroidered in golden scrolls except for the horizontal stripes of red, green, and white that ran from neck to hem over snug green breeches and heeled blue boots. It seemed the fashion had traveled after all. She made a curtsy, even so, though it looked odd in that garb. Lews Therin hummed even harder, but he wished the man had a face so he could hit him. Moraine was a memory for hardening his soul, not for humming at. "My Lord Dragon," Darlin said, bowing stiffly. He was not a man accustomed to offering the first curtsy. He gave no bow for Cadsuane, just a sharp look before he seemed to dismiss her presence entirely. She kept him and Caroline as guests for a time in Cairhien. He was unlikely to forget that, or forgive. At his gesture, the two serving women moved quickly to offer wine. As might have been expected, Cadsuane, with her ageless face, received the first goblet, but surprisingly, Nynaeve got the second. The Dragon Reborn was one thing, a woman wearing the Great Serpent Ring, something else again, even in Tyr. Throwing her cloak back, Cadsuane retreated to the wall. It was unlike her to be retiring, but then from there she could observe everyone at once. Olivia took a place by the door, doubtless for much the same reason. "I am glad to see you better than when I saw you last," Darlin went on. "You've done me great honor, though I may yet lose my head for it if your Aes Sedai make no more progress than they have." "Don't be sulky, Darlin," Caroline murmured, her throaty voice sounding amused. "Men do sulk, do they not, men?" For some reason, Min barked a laugh. "What are you doing here?" Rand demanded of the two people he had not expected to see. He took a goblet from one of the serving women while the other hesitated between Min and Olivia. Min won out, perhaps because Olivia's blue dress was plain. Sipping her wine, Min strolled over to Caroline. At a glance from the Cairhienin woman, Darlin moved away, grinning, and the two women stood with their heads together, whispering. Filled with the power, Rand could catch the occasional word. His name, Darlin's. Wireman Santiago, also a High Lord of Tyr, was not short, and he stood as straight as a sword. Yet there was something of a strutting rooster about him. His gray-streaked beard, trimmed to a point and oiled, practically quivered with pride. "Hail to the Lord of the Morning," he said, bowing, or rather he intoned it. Wireman was a great one for intoning and declaiming. "Why am I here, my Lord Dragon?" He sounded puzzled at the question. "Why, when I heard that Darlin was besieged in the stone, what could I do but come to his aid? Burn my soul, I tried to talk some of the others into accompanying me. We'd have put a quick end to Estanda and that lot, I vow." He clutched a fist to demonstrate how he would have crushed the rebels. But only Anaiella had the courage. The Cairhienin were a complete lot of lily hearts. Caroline paused to talk with Min to give him a look that would have had him hunting for the stab wound had he noticed it. Astro pursed his lips and commenced a study of his wine. The High Lady Anaiella Narin-Salona also wore a coat and snug breeches with heeled boots, though she had added a white lace ruff, and her green coat was sewn with pearls. A close cap of pearls sat atop her dark hair. A slim, pretty woman, she offered a simpering curtsy and somehow made it seem she wanted to kiss Rand's hand. Courage was not a word he would have applied to her. Nerve, on the other hand. "My Lord Dragon," she cooed. "I wish we could report complete success, but my master of died fighting the Shongshan, and you left most of my armsmen in Ilion. Still we managed to strike a blow in your name." "Success? A blow?" Alana's scowl took in Wireman and Anaiella both before she twisted back around to face Rand. "They landed at the Stone's docks with one ship, but they put most of their armsmen and all the mercenaries they hired in Cairhien ashore from the rest upriver, with orders to enter the city and attack the rebels." She made a sound of disgust. "The only result was a great many men dead, and our negotiations with the rebels thrown back to the beginning." Anaiella's simper took on a sickly twist. "My plan was to sortie from the stone and attack them from both sides," Wireman protested. "Darlin refused. Refused!" Darlin was not grinning now. He stood with his feet apart and looked a man who wished he had a sword in his hand rather than a goblet. "I told you then, Wireman, if I stripped the stone of defenders, the rebels would still have outnumbered us badly. Too badly. They've hired every sellsword from the Aranon to the Bay of Ramara. Rand took a chair, flinging one arm over the back. The heavy arms had no supports at the front, so his sword was no problem. Caroline and Min seemed to have switched their talk to clothing. At least, they were fingering each other's coats, and he heard words like backstitch and bias cut, whatever that meant. Alana's gaze drifted between him and Min, and he felt disbelief warring with suspicion along the bond. I left you two in Kyrian because I wanted you in Kyrian, he said. He trusted neither, but they could cause small harm in Kyrian, where they were outlanders without power. Anger, heated by nausea, entered his voice. You will make plans to return there as soon as possible. As soon as possible. Anayella's simper grew more sickly, and she cringed slightly. Wireman was made of sterner stuff. My lord, I will serve you where you command, but I can serve best on my native soil. I know these rebels, know where they can be trusted and where. As soon as possible, Rand snapped, slamming his fist down on the chair arm hard enough to make the wood creak loudly. One, Cadsuane said, quite clearly and quite incomprehensibly. I strongly suggest you do as he says, Lord Wireman. Nynaeve eyed Wireman blandly, took a sip of wine. He has a temper lately, worse than ever, and you don't want it directed at you. Cadsuane exhaled a heavy breath. Stay out of this, girl, she said sharply. Nynaeve glared at her, opened her mouth, then grimaced and closed it again. Gripping her braid, she glided across the carpet to join Min and Caroline. She had gotten very good at gliding. Wireman studied Cadsuane for a moment, tilting back his head so he was staring down his nose. As the Dragon Reborn commands, he said finally, so does Wireman Santiago obey. My ship can be ready to sail by tomorrow, I wager. Will that suffice? Rand nodded curtly. It would have to answer. He was not about to waste a moment making a gateway to send this pair of fools where they belong today. There's hunger in the city, he said, eyeing the golden bear. How many days would that much gold feed Tyr? The thought of food made his stomach clench, and waited for a response that was quick in coming, if not from the direction he expected. Darlin had cattle and sheep herded down to the city, Caroline said with some considerable warmth. Rand was the one getting the dagger look now. These days, she faltered for a moment, though the heat never left her gaze. These days, meat is inedible 2 days after slaughter, so he had the animals brought and wagons full of grain. Estanda and her companions seized it all for themselves. Darlin gave her a fond smile, but his voice was apologetic. I've tried 3 times, but Estanda is greedy, it seems. I saw no point in continuing to supply my enemies, your enemies. Rand nodded. At least the man was not ignoring the situation in the city. There are 2 boys who live outside the walls, Donnie and Com. I don't know any more name than that. About age 10. Once the rebels are settled, and you can leave the stone, I would appreciate it if you found them and kept an eye on them. Min made a sound in her throat, and the bond carried sadness so bleak it almost overwhelmed the burst of love that came with it. So, it must have been death she saw. But she had been wrong about Moraine. Maybe this viewing could be changed by ta'veren. No, Lews Therin growled. Her viewings must not change. We have to die. Rand ignored him. Darlin appeared puzzled by the request, but he acceded. As what else was he to do when the Dragon Reborn made it? Rand was about to bring up the purpose of his visit when Bera Harkin, another of the Aes Sedai he had sent to Tyr to deal with the rebels, entered the room frowning over her shoulder as if the maidens had made some difficulty for her. They might well have. The Aiel considered the Aes Sedai sworn to him to be Wise One's apprentices, and maidens took every opportunity to remind apprentices that they were not Wise Ones yet. She was a stocky woman with brown hair cut close around a square face, and despite her green silks, lacking Aes Sedai agelessness, she would have looked a farm wife. A farm wife who ruled her house and farm with a firm hand, though, and would tell a king not to track mud into her kitchen. She was Green Ajah, after all, with every scrap of Green Ajah pride and haughtiness. She frowned at Olivia, too, with all the disdain of Aes Sedai for Wilder, and that faded only to coolness when she caught sight of Rand. "Well, I must say I shouldn't be surprised to see you, considering what's happened this morning," she said. Unpinning her simple silver cloak brooch, she fastened it to her belt pouch and folded the cloak over her arm. "Though it might have been the news that the others are no more than a day west of the Eranin." "The others?" Rand said quietly and steely hard. Bera did not seem impressed. She went on arranging the folds of her cloak. "The other high lords and ladies, of course. Sunaman, Tolmaran, all of them. Apparently, they're traveling hot foot for Tyr as fast as their armsmen's horses can move." Rand leaped up so fast that his sword bound for a moment on the chair arm. Only a moment, because the gilded wood, weakened by his earlier blow, split with a loud crack and the arm dropped to the carpet. He never so much as glanced at it. The fools! The Seanchan at the border with Altara, and they were coming back to Tyr? "Doesn't anybody remember how to obey?" he thundered. "I want messengers sent to them immediately. They're to return to Ilion faster than they left, or I'll have the lot of them hanged." "Two," Cadsuane said. What in the light was she counting? "A bit of advice, boy. Ask her what happened this morning. I smell good news." Bera gave a little start at realizing Cadsuane was in the room. Eyeing her sideways, and cautiously, she stopped fiddling with her cloak. "We've reached agreement," she said, as if the question had been asked. Tadosian and Simon were wavering, as usual, but Herne was nearly as adamant as Istanda. She shook her head. "I think Tadosian and Simon might have come around sooner, but some fellows with strange accents have been promising them gold and men." "Seanchan," Nynaeve said. Olivia opened her mouth, then closed it without speaking. "They might be," Bera allowed. "They keep clear of us and look at us like we were mad dogs that might bite any moment. That sounds like what little I've heard of Seanchan. In any case, less than an hour gone, Istanda suddenly began asking whether the Lord Dragon would restore her title and lands, and they all collapsed right behind her. The agreement is this. Darlin is accepted as steward in Tyr for the Dragon Reborn. All laws you made remain unchanged, and they pay for feeding the city for 1 year as a fine for rebellion. In return, they receive full restoration. Darlin is crowned king of Tyr, and they swear fealty to him. Marana and Rathella are preparing the documents for signatures and seals." "King?" Darlin said incredulously. Caroline swayed over to take his arm. "Restoration?" Rand growled, hurling his goblet aside in a spray of wine. The bond carried caution, a warning from Min, but he was too angry to pay heed. The sickness twisting his insides twisted his rage, too. "Blood and bloody ashes, I stripped them of lands and titles for rebelling against me. They can stay commoners and swear fealty to me." "3," Cadsuane said, and Rand's skin popped out in goosebumps an instant before something struck him across the bottom like a hard-swung switch. Bera's lips parted in shock, and the cloak slid off her arm to the floor. Nynaeve laughed. She smothered it quickly, but she laughed. "Don't make me have to keep reminding you about manners, boy," Cadsuane went on. "Alana told me the terms you offered before she left. Darlin as steward, your laws kept, everything else on the table. And it seems they've been met. You can do as you wish, of course, but another piece of advice. When the terms you offer are accepted, hold to them." "Else no one will trust you," Lews Therin said, sounding entirely sane, for the moment. Rand glared at Cadsuane, fists clenched, on the brink of weaving something that would singe her. He could feel a welt on his bottom, and would feel it more in the saddle. It seemed to pulse, and his anger pulsed with it. She peered back calmly over her wine. Was there a hint of challenge in her gaze? Of daring him to channel? The woman spent every moment in his presence challenging him. The trouble was, her advice was good. He had given Alanna those terms. He had expected them to bargain harder, gain more, but they had gotten what he actually asked for. More. He had not thought of fines. "It seems your fortunes have risen, King Darlin," he said. One of the serving women curtsied and handed Rand another full goblet of wine. Her face was as calm as any Aes Sedai's. You might have thought men arguing with sisters was a matter of every day with her. "All hail King Darlin," Wireman intoned, sounding half strangled, and after a moment, Aniela echoed him, as breathless as if she had run a mile. Once she had talked of herself for a crown in Tyr. "But why would they want me as king?" Darlin said, scrubbing a hand through his hair. "Or anyone. There have been no kings in the stone since Morina died 1,000 years ago. Or did you demand that, Bera Sedai?" Bera straightened from picking up her cloak and began shaking it out. "It was their demand would be too strong. Their suggestion. Any of them would have leapt at the chance of a throne, especially Estanda." Aniela made a choking sound. "But of course they knew there was no hope of that. This way they can swear to you instead of to the Dragon Reborn, making it slightly less distasteful." "And if you are king," Caroline put in, "it means that steward in Tyr for the Lord Dragon becomes a lesser title." She laughed throatily. "They may even tack on 3 or 4 more noble-sounding titles to try pushing it down to obscurity." Bera pursed her lips as though she had been about to bring up that very point. "And would you marry a king, Caroline?" Darlin asked. "I'll accept the crown if you will. Though I'll have to have a crown made." Min cleared her throat. "I can tell you how it should look, if you like." Caroline laughed again and released Darlin's arm, swaying away from him. "I will have to see you in it before I could answer that. Have Min's crown made. And if it makes you look pretty," she smiled, "then perhaps I will consider it." "I wish you both the best," Rand said curtly. "But there are more important matters to go into right now." Min gave him a sharp look, disapproval flooding the bond. Nynaeve gave him a sharp look. What was that about? "You will accept that crown, Darlin, and as soon as those documents are signed, I want you to arrest those Seanchan. Then gather every man in Tyr who knows one end of sword or halberd from the other. I'll arrange for Ashaman to take you to Arad Daman." "And me, my Lord Dragon?" Wireman asked avidly. He all but quivered with eagerness, managing to strut while standing still. "If there is fighting to be done, I can serve you better there than languishing in Cairhien." Rand studied the man, and Aniela. Wireman was a bungling idiot, and he trusted neither, but he could not see what harm they could do with no more than a handful of followers. "Very well, you two may accompany the High Lord, that is, King Darlin." Aniela gulped as though she, for one, would rather return to Cairhien. "But what am I supposed to do in Arad Daman?" Darlin wanted to know. "The little I've heard of that land, it's a madhouse." Lews Therin laughed wildly in Rand's head. "Tarmangaiden is coming soon," Rand said. "The light's end not too soon. You are going to Arad Daman to get ready for Tarmangaiden."
Chapter 22. To make an anchor weep. Despite the pitching induced by the long blue rollers, Harina din Togara sat very straight alongside her sister, just ahead of their parasol bearers and the steersman at his long tiller. Shallan seemed intent on studying the 12 men and women working the oars, or perhaps she was deep in thought. There was plenty to think on of late. not least this meeting Harina had been summoned to, but she let her thoughts drift blindly, composing herself. Every time the first 12 of the Asa an Mier met since she had attained Ilion, she had needed to compose herself before attending. When she reached Tyr and found Zaida's blue gull still anchored in the river, she had been sure the woman was in Camelin yet, or at least trailing far behind her own wake. A painful mistake, that.
Excuse
Though
me.
in truth, very little would have been altered had Zaida been weeks behind. Not for Harina, at least, no. No thoughts of Zaida. The sun stood only a fist above the horizon in the east, and several vessels of the shorebound were making for the long breakwater that guarded Ilion's harbor. One carried 3 masts and a semblance of a high rig, all the major sails square, yet he was squat and ill-handled, wallowing through the low, rolling seas in fountains of spray rather than slicing them. Most were small and low-rigged, their triangular sails nearly all high-boomed. Some seemed quick enough, but since the shore-bound seldom sailed beyond sight of land and usually anchored at night for fear of shoals, their quickness availed them little. Cargo that required true speed went to Asa an Mier ships, at a premium price, to be sure. It was a small portion of what Asa an Mier carried, in part because of the price, in part because few things actually required their speed. Besides, cargo hire guaranteed some profit, but when the cargo master traded on his own for the ship, all of the profit went to vessel and clan. As far as the eye could see, to east and west along the coastline, Asa an Mier ships lay at anchor, rakers and skimmers, soarers and darters, most surrounded by bumboats so cluttered they looked like drunken shore festivals. Rowed out from the city, the bumboats offered for sale everything from dried fruit to quartered beeves and sheep, from iron nails and iron stock to swords and daggers, from gaudy trinkets of Ilion that might catch a deckhand's eye to gold and gems, though the gold was usually a thin plate that wore off in a few months to show the brass beneath, and the gems colored glass. They brought rats, too, if not for sale. Anchored so long, every ship was plagued by rats now. Rats and spoilage made sure there was always a market for the peddlers. Bumboats also surrounded the massive Shonshan-built vessels, dozens upon dozens of them that had been used in the escape. That was what it was being called now, the Great Escape from Ebu Dar. Say the escape, and no one asked what escape you meant. Great bluff-bowed things they were, twice the beam of a raker and more, some, suitable for battering through heavy seas, perhaps, but strangely rigged, and with odd ribbed sails too stiff for proper setting. Men and women were swarming over those masts and yards now, altering the rigging to something more usable. No one wanted the craft, but the shipyards would require years to replace all of the vessels lost at Ebu Dar, and the expense. Overly beany or not, those ships would see many years of use. No sailmistress had any desire to sink into debt, borrowing from the clan coffers, when most, if not all, of her own gold was being salvaged by the Shonshan in Ebu Dar, not unless she had no other choice. Some, unlucky enough to have neither their own ships nor one of the Shonshans, did have no other choice. Harina's 12 passed the heavy wall of the breakwater, thick with dark slime and long hairy weed that the breakers crashing against the grey stone failed to dislodge, and the broad grey-green harbor of Ilion opened up before her, ringed with deep expanses of marsh, just turning from winter-brown to green in patches where long-legged birds waded. A line of mist drifted across the boat on a gentle breeze, dampening her hair before it passed on up the harbor. Small fishing boats were pulling their nets along the edges of the marsh, a dozen sorts of gull and tern wheeling overhead to steal what they could. The city did not interest her beyond the long stone docks, lined with trading craft, but the harbor. That broad, nearly circular expanse of water was the greatest anchorage known, and filled with shipping and river craft, most waiting their turn at the docks. It truly was filled by hundreds of vessels in every shape and size, and not all of those ships belonged to the shorebound. There were only rakers here. those slender masters that could race porpoises, rakers, and 3 of the ungainly Shonshan monstrosities. They were the vessels of wave
Got a little bit of
mistresses
wax on
and of
that
sail mistresses who formed the first 12 of each clan, those that could be fitted into the harbor before there was no more room. Even Ilian's anchorage had its limits, and the Council of 9, not to mention this steward in Ilion for the Dragon Reborn, would have made trouble had the Athanmier begun crowding their trade. Abruptly, a strong, icy wind came up out of the north. No, it did not come up. It just suddenly was there full strength, stripping the harbor to choppy white caps and carrying a smell of pines and something earthy. She knew little of trees, but much of timbers used in building ships, though she did not think there were many pines anywhere near to Ilion. Then she noticed the mist line. While ships rocked and pitched under that southerly blast, the mist continued its slow drift northward. Keeping her hands on her knees required effort. She wanted very much to wipe the dampness out of her hair. She had thought after Shah and her death that nothing ever was so unfunny, but she had seen too many oddities of late, oddities that spoke of the world twisting. As abruptly as it had come, the wind was gone. Murmurs rose, the stroke faltered, and the number 4 port oar caught a crab, splashing water into the boat. The crew knew winds did not behave that way. "Steady there," Harina said firmly. "Steady." "Give way together, you shore-bound rag-pickers!" her deck mistress shouted from the bows. Lean and leathery, Jadine had leather lungs as well. "Do I need to call the stroke for you?" The twin insults tightened some faces in anger, others in chagrin, but the oars began moving smoothly again. Shallan was studying the mist now. Asking what she saw, what she thought, would have to wait. Harina was not sure she wanted the answer heard by any of her crew. They had seen enough to have them frightened already. The steersman turned the 12 toward one of the bulky Shonshan ships, where any bumboat that ventured near was being chased away before the peddler could get out 2 words. It was one of the largest of them, with a towering stern castle that had 3 levels. 3! And the thing actually had a pair of balconies across the stern. She would not care to see what a following sea driven by a Samaros or one of the Sohins would do to those. Other 12s and a few 8s waited their turn to sidle up to the vessel in the order of precedence of their passengers. Jadine stood up in the bow and bellowed, "Showdine!" Her voice carried well, and a 12 that was approaching the ship circled away. The others continued their waiting. Harina did not stand until the crew had backed oars and drawn them in on the starboard, bringing the 12 to a smooth halt right where Jadine could catch a dangling line and hold the small craft alongside the larger. Shallan sighed.
Fucking moss.
"Courage, sister," Harina told her. "We have survived Shadar Logoth. Though the light helped me, I am unsure what we survived." She barked a laugh. "More than that, we survived Cadsuane Malydrin, and I doubt anyone else here could do that." Shallan smiled weakly, but at least she smiled. Harina scrambled up the rope ladder as easily as she could have 20 years before, and was piped aboard by the deckmaster, a squat fellow with a fresh scar running under the leather patch that covered where his right eye had been. Many had taken wounds in the escape. Many had died. Even the deck of this ship felt strange beneath her bare feet, the planking laid in an odd pattern. The side was manned properly, however. 12 bare-chested men to her left, 12 women in bright linen blouses to her right, all bowing till they were looking straight down at the deck. She waited for Shallan and the parasol-bearers to join her before starting forward. The vessel's sailmistress and wind-finder at the end of the rows bowed less deeply while touching heart lips and forehead. Both wore waist-long white mourning stoles that all but hid their many necklaces, as did she and Shallan. "The welcome of my ship to you, Wave Mistress," the sailmistress said, sniffing her scent box. "And the grace of the light be upon you until you leave his decks. The others await you in the great cabin." "The grace of the light be upon you also," Harina replied. Touraine, in blue silk trousers and a red silk blouse, was stocky enough to make her wind-finder, Surreal, look slender rather than average, and she had a gimlet eye and a sour twist to her mouth. But neither those nor the sniffing was meant for discourtesy. Touraine was not that bold. The gaze was the same she gave everyone. Her own vessel lay at the bottom of the harbor at Ebou Dar, and the harbor did stink after the clean air of the open salt. The great cabin ran nearly the whole length of the tall stern castle, a space clear of any furniture save for 13 chairs and a table against the bulkhead that held tall-necked wine pitchers and goblets of yellow porcelain, and 24 women in brocaded silks could not come near filling it. She was the last of the first 12 of the Atha Anmier to arrive, and the reaction to her among the other wave mistresses was what she had come to expect. Lincora and Waline turned their backs very deliberately. Round-faced Niala gave her a scowl, then stalked over to refill her goblet. Lacine, so slender that her bosom seemed immense, shook her head, as if wondering at Harina's presence. Others went on chatting as if she were not there. All wore the mourning stoles, of course. Polana strode across the deck to her, the long pink scar down the right side of her square face giving her a dangerous look. Her tightly curled hair was nearly all gray, the honor chain across her left cheek heavy with gold medallions recording her triumphs, including one for her part in the escape. Her wrists and ankles still bore the marks of Shanshan chains, though hidden by her silks now. "I hope you are quite recovered, Harina the Light Willing," she said, tilting her head to one side and clasping her plump, tattooed hands in mock sympathy. "Not still sitting tender, are you? I put a cushion on your chair, just in case." She laughed uproariously, looking to her wind finder, but Kyra gave her a blank look as if she had not heard, then added a faint laugh. Polana frowned. When she laughed at anything, she expected those under her to laugh as well. The stately windfinder had her own worries, however. A daughter missing among the shorebound, abducted by Aes Sedai. There would be repayment for that. One did not need to like Kyra or Polana to know that was necessary. Harina favored the pair with a tight smile and brushed by Polana closely enough that the woman had to step back or have her feet trodden on, scowling as she did. Daughter of the Sands, Harina thought sourly. Morael's approach brought a genuine smile, however. The tall, slender woman, her shoulder-length hair as much white as black, had been her friend since they began as deckhands together on an aging raker with an iron-handed sail mistress embittered by her lack of prospects. Learning that Morael had escaped Ebou Dar and unharmed had been a joy. She favored Polana
Hey,
and Kyra
Space Spider, how you doing?
To Brayla, her windfinder also
not much,
praised the
just
pair, but unlike them, it was
smoking a
not
bowl,
because Morael
listening to a
demanded
book.
wrist-licking. Sisters, Brayla and Kyra shared a deep concern for Talan, Kyra's daughter.
You know what, let's do it, Dab, since
Either
you're
would have
here.
slit the other's throat
Give
for
me a
copper.
reason
Or better,
bust
in their
out my
view,
Dr.
seeing
Dabber.
her sister reduced to cleaning the bilges. There was no hatred deeper than hatred between siblings. "Don't let those mud ducks peck at you, Harina." Morael's voice was deep for a woman, but melodious. She handed Harina one of the 2 goblets she carried. "You did what you felt you had to do, and the Light Willing, all will come right."
Hey, sports talk.
Against her will, Harina's eyes went to the ring
I don't know.
set in one of the
Might
rooms
pay my
above.
mom a visit. I don't know
It
yet.
had been removed by now. She was sure it remained for the purpose of provoking her. That strange young woman Min had been right. Her bargain with the Koramor had been judged deficient, giving away too much and demanding too little in return. In this same cabin with the rest of the first 12 and the new mistress of the ship's watching, she had been stripped and hung by her ankles from that ring bolt, stretched tight to another set in the deck, and strapped until she howled her lungs out. The welts and bruises had faded, but the memory lingered however
no.
long she tried to suppress it.
I don't get up early
Not
enough
howls
for
for
that,
mercy
dude.
or respite, though. Never that. Else she would have had no alternative to stepping aside, becoming just a sail mistress again, while someone else was chosen wave
I
mistress.
don't get up anywhere near
Most
close
of the
to
women
any
in this
type of
room
breakfast
believed
time.
she should have done so anyway after such a punishment. Perhaps even Morael. But she had the other part of Min's foretelling to bolster her courage. She would be mistress of the ships one day. In law, the first 12 of the Atha an Mier could choose any sail mistress as mistress of the ship. Yet only 5 times in more than 3,000 years had they reached outside their own number. The Aes Sedai said
Around
peculiar
anywhere
visions
between
always came true,
10
not intent
and
to
noon.
gamble. All
Depends
will come
whenever I
right,
want to
Marail.
get up.
The light willing, she said. Eventually. She just had to have the courage to ride out whatever came before. As usual, Zyda arrived without ceremony, striding in, followed by Shylin, her wind-finder, tall and slim and reserved, and Amelia, the bosomy, pale-haired Aes Sedai Zyda had brought back with her from Camelin. Ageless face seemingly permanently surprised, her startling blue eyes very wide, the Aes Sedai was breathing heavily. Everyone bowed. Zyda paid the courtesies no heed. Brocades and white mourning veils, short, with a close cap of graying curls. Yet she managed to make herself seem every bit as tall as Shylin.
Oh, 5:30 down.
Serena had to admit. Zyda had that, and a coolness of thought that being caught by a Samaras on a leash.
That's a little too early for me.
In addition to returning with the first of the Aes Sedai,
But I like half a breakfast.
the bowl of the
I don't know.
She also had returned with her own bargain for land under Atha an Mier law, and where Harina's bargain had been judged wanting, Zyda's had found great benefit. That and the fact that she had gone straight to Ilion via one of those peculiar gateways woven by her own wind-finder were not the only reasons.
The Dr. Dabber.
Ships, but neither had hurt her cause. Harina herself thought this traveling overrated. Shallon could make a gateway now, but making one to the deck of a ship without causing damage, even on still waters like these, especially from the deck of another ship, was chancy at best. No one could make one large enough to sail a ship through. Overrated. The man has not arrived yet, Zyda announced, taking the chair with its back to the large stern windows and arranging her long, fringed red sash, just so, adjusting the angle of the emerald-studded dagger thrust through. It was a very particular moment. It was natural enough to want everything in its place on board a ship. Tidiness became a habit as well as a necessity, yet she was exacting even by the usual. The remaining chairs, none fastened to the fashion, made 2 rows facing each other, and the wave mistresses began taking their seats, each woman's wind-finder standing behind her chair. It appears he intends us to wait on him. Amelia, see that the goblets are all filled. It seemed the woman had put her foot wrong yet again. Amelia jumped, then gathered her bronze-colored skirts to her knees and went racing for the table where the wine drinkers sat. That's Harina wondered how long Zyda would continue to allow her to wear pants rather than trousers, which were much more practical shipboard. It would surely be a shock to her when they passed beyond sight of land and blouses were abandoned. Of the brown Aja, Amelia had wanted to study the Atha an Mier, but she was given little time to study. Her purpose was to work, and Zyda saw that she did. She was there to teach the wind all that the Aes Sedai knew. She still dithered over that, but shore-bound instructors, rare as they were, ranked barely a whisker above the deckhands. In the beginning, the woman apparently had believed her dignity fully equal to Zyda's, if not more, and the deck-master's flail, laid with some frequent regularity across her rump, supposedly was changing her mind.
Him, he's like, where are you from? Like,
Amelia
what
had
state
actually
you
tried
from?
dessert 3 times. Strangely, she did not know how to knowledge that carefully was being used, and she should have known she was being watched too closely to bribe her way onto the plate. Well, she was unlikely to try again. Reportedly, she'd been told that a 4th attempt would earn a public strapping this time, followed by being hung by her ankles in the rigging. No one would risk that shame, surely. Sail mistresses
Yeah, sports talk,
had been reduced to deckhands and gone
space miners from
eager to lose
the same
themselves
state
in
that
their
I'm
place
from.
in a mass of men and women hauling lines and handling sail. Removing the cushion from the seat of her chair and dropping it disdainfully on the deck, Harina took her place at the bottom of the left-hand row, Shallon at her back. She was the least senior except for Maria, seated across from her. But then Zyda would have sat only one chair farther up had she not gained the 6th fat golden earring for each ear and the chains that connected them. Her lobes might still be sore from the symptoms. A pleasant thought. As he makes us wait, perhaps we should make him wait when he finally does appear. With an untouched goblet in hand, she waved away the anxious Aes Sedai, who scurried over to Moran. Foolish woman. Did she not know that she was the mistress of the ships first, and then followed with the brave mistress's bond? Zyda toyed with her piercework scent box, hanging on a very heavy golden chain around her neck. She wore a wide, close-fitting collar of heavy gold links, too, a gift from Elaine of Andor. He comes from the Cormor, she said,
Aim Sports Talk.
whom you were supposed to stick to like a barnacle. Her voice never hardened, but every word cut at Harina. This man will be as close as I can come to speaking to the Cormor without doubt, since you agreed he did not have to attend me more than 3 times in any period of 2 years. Because of you, I must accept this man's discourtesy if he turns out to be a scabrous drunkard who must run to the rail and empty his stomach every second sentence. The ambassador I send to the Cormor will be someone who knows how to obey her orders. Helena tittered and smirked. She thought everyone was like herself. Shallan squeezed Harina's shoulder reassuringly, but she did not need it. Stay with the Cormor? There was no way she could explain to anyone, even Shallan, Cadsuan's methods of enforcing her will, with a total lack of respect for Harina's dignity. She had been an ambassador from the Afa Anier in name, and forced to dance to the tune the Aes
which
Sedai
one?
piped. She was willing to admit
And
that
what do you want to
she
talk
almost
about him
wept
about?
with relief when she realized that cursed woman was going to let her leave. Besides, that girl's visions always came true. So the Aes Sedai said, and they could not lie. It was enough. Turain slipped into the cabin and bowed to Zyda. The Coromor's emissary has arrived, shipmistress. He stepped out of a gateway on the quarterdeck. That created murmurs among the windfinders, and Amelia
On my
jerked his
shoulders and
fell
arms,
deck
what do you
into
mean?
his flail again. I hope he did not damage your deck too badly.
There's no
Turain,
specific
Zyda
reason
said.
that
Harina
I picked
sipped
what I
on
got
the
besides,
small smile.
I liked it at the
Man
time.
must be made to wait a little, at least. Not at all, shipmistress. Turain sounded surprised. The gateway opened a good foot above the deck, and he stepped through from
All the
one of the city's
tattoo
docks.
stories.
Yes, Shallan whispered. I can see how to do
Really
it.
not much to them. I liked
She
them.
thought anything to do with the power was
Thought it was
wonderful.
cool. And
That must have been a shock,
Got it.
seeing a stone dock above your quarterdeck, Zyda said. Very well. I will see whether the Cormor has sent me a scabrous drunkard. Send him in, Turain, but do not rush. Amelia, am I
I
to
got my
get any
head
wine
tattooed
before
also.
nightfall? The Aes Sedai gasped, and making little whimpers as if on the point of tears, rushed to fetch a goblet as Turain bowed and left. Light. What had Amelia done? Long months passed, and Zyda had her wine well before a large man with dark hair curling to his broad shoulders entered the cabin. He certainly was not scabrous, nor did he appear drunk. The high collar of his black coat held a silver pin in the shape of a sword on one side, and on the other a red and gold pin shaped like one of the creatures that entwined the Coromor's forearms. A dragon. Yes, that was what it was called. A round pin fastened to his left shoulder showed 3 golden crowns against blue enamel. A sigil, perhaps? Was he a shore-bound noble? Could the Coromor actually have done Zyda honor in sending this man? Knowing Rand al'Thor as she did, she doubted it had been intentional. It was
Not
not that he
really.
tried to dishonor anyone, yet he
What can I
cared
say?
little for the honors of others.
besides, I
He
liked them.
bowed to Zyda, handling the sword at his side smoothly, but he failed to touch heart and lips and forehead. Still, some shortcomings had to be overlooked with the shorebound. I apologize if I arrive late, shipmistress, he said. but it seemed unnecessary to come before all of your number were here. He must have a very good-looking glass to have observed that from the docks. Studying him up and down with a frown, Zaida sipped her wine. You have a name? I am Loghain, he said simply. Half the women in the room exhaled sharply, and most of the rest let their jaws drop. More than one slopped wine from her goblet. Not Zaida and not Harina, but the others. Loghain. That was a name known even to the Alfa-an-Mier. May I speak, shipmistress? Amelia asked breathily. She was clutching the porcelain pitcher so hard that Harina feared it might shatter in her hands, but the woman had learned enough sense to say no more until Zaida nodded. Then words spilled from her in a breathless rush. This man was a false dragon. He was gentled for it. How it is he can channel again, I cannot know, but he channels Saidin. Saidin! He is tainted, shipmistress. If you deal with him, you will incur the wrath of the White Tower. I know enough, Zaida cut in. You should be well aware by now how much I fear the wrath of the White Tower. But Zaida held up a single finger.
Probably not.
And Aes Sedai's mouth snapped shut, her lips twisting in a sickly fashion. That one word might lead to her kissing the deckmaster's sister again, and she knew it. What she says is true in part, Loghain said calmly. I am an Asha'man, but there is no taint any longer. Saidin is clean. The Creator decided
At least
to
she
show us
stopped.
mercy.
At least she didn't keep going.
Whom do you serve, Aes Sedai? Egwene Al'Vir or Elaida Aroyhan? Wisely, Amelia kept her mouth shut. For the next year, she serves me, Loghain, Zaida said firmly. The Aes Sedai squeezed her pale eyes shut for a moment, and when they opened again, they were even wider than before, impossible as that seemed, and they held a look of horror. Was it possible she had believed Zaida might relent and let her go early? You can confine your questions to me, the shipmistress went on. But first I have two for you. Where is the Coromor? I must send an ambassador to him, and he must keep her close in accordance with the bargain. Remind him of that. And what message do you bring from him? A request for some service, I suppose.
Do I watch sports?
Where he is,
Not really.
say. The man smiled slightly.
I find sports
He smiled.
to be
I
boring.
demand, Zaida began, but he cut her off, provoking angry mutters and hot glares from the other women. The fool seemed to think he was an equal to the mistress of the ships.
Yeah? You can always
He
do
wants his
that
whereabouts kept secret
because
from now,
it always
shipmistress.
make you remember
The
that point
Forsaken have
in
made
time.
efforts to kill him. I am willing to take Karina din Togara with me, however. From what I heard, I think he found her acceptable. Harina jerked so hard she spilled wine over the back of her hand, then took another long swallow. But no. Zaida would divorce Amel and marry a ballast stone before she sent Harina din Togara as her ambassador. Still, even the thought of it was enough to make her tongue stick to the roof of her mouth. Even becoming mistress of the ships might be insufficient recompense for being forced to endure cow sweat any longer. Studying Loghain with a stony face, Zaida told Amelia to pour wine for him.
I'm not saying anything bad about sports. It's just
the table, she was trembling
not
so
something
hard
that's ever
that
caught
her
my
spout
interest.
clattered on the rim of the goblet. Almost as much wine went onto the deck as inside the goblet. Strangely, Loghain walked over to her and put his hands on hers to steady her. Was he one of those who could not leave others to do their own work? You've nothing to fear from me, Amelia Sedai, he told her. It's been a long time since I ate anyone for breakfast. She stared up at him with her mouth hanging open as though uncertain whether he was making a joke. And the service he requests? Zaida said. Not a request, shipmistress. He had to straighten the pitcher to keep the goblet from overflowing. Taking the goblet, he stepped away from Amelia, but she stood gaping at his back.
Yeah,
right, but the
I
woman
could tell.
found no end of ways to get into trouble. A call on your side of the bargain with the Coromor. Among other things, you promised him ships. and he needs ships to carry food and other supplies to Bandar Eben from Ilion and Tyr. That can be done, Zaida said, not quite masking her relief, though she shot
Right,
a frown
Space
at
Miner.
Helena. Helena glared as well, of course, but so did Lasine and Niala and several others. Helena suppressed a sigh.
Hey, that's definitely how it is
Some
down
of the
here.
details of the bargain were quite onerous, she had to admit, such as the requirement that the mistress of the ships be prepared to attend him up to 3 times in any 2 years. The Jendai prophecy said the Afa-An-Nier were to serve the Koromor, yet few opinions of how they were to serve included the mistress of the ships going running when he called. But the others had not been there, bargaining with Aes Sedai, convinced that she had no alternative to making whatever bargain she could.
That I
Think
am.
of the light, it was a wonder she had gotten as much as she had. Supplies for more than 1 million people, shipmistress. Logain
Although I
added
don't
as
watch it
wisely
much
as if you were
anymore,
asking
but
for
yeah,
another
since
goblet
I
of
was
wine.
younger.
How many more I cannot say, but Bandar Eben itself is starving. The ships must
Both
arrive as soon as
me
possible.
and my brother,
Shock rippled
most
through the
hated
cabin.
grower, is a Cowboys
Harina
fan.
was not alone in taking a long drink of wine. Even Zaida's eyes widened in amazement. That might require more rakers than we possess, she said at last, unable to keep the incredulity from her voice. Logain shrugged as though that were of no account. Even so, that is what he requires of you. Use other ships if you must. Zaida stiffened in her chair. Required. Bargain or no bargain, that was imprudent language to use.
I know. I just don't do
Touraine slipped into the cabin
panels.
again,
Never
and in breach
have.
of all protocol, ran to Zaida, her bare feet slapping the deck.
Maybe eventually I
Bending
will,
close, she whispered into the
but
shipmistress's
I never
ear.
have.
Zaida's face slowly took on a look of horror. She half raised her scent box, then shuddered and let it fall to her bosom. Send her in, she said.
Unless
Send
I
her
find
in
one of your
immediately.
Metro teams.
There is news to make an anchor weep, she went on, as Touraine raced from the cabin. I will let you hear it from she who brought it. You must wait, she added when Logain opened his mouth. You must wait.
Hey, John McDonald, how you doing,
But
bro?
not enough to hide his impatience, stalking to the side of the cabin to stand with his mouth tight and his brows
How's your
drawn
night
down.
going, John McDonald?
The young woman who entered and bowed deeply to Zaida was tall and lean,
I
and she
don't know.
might have been lovely,
Just,
except that her face was haggard. Her blue linen
I
blouse
don't
and
know. I
green
just never
trousers
really
looked as if
have.
they'd been worn for days, and she swayed on her feet with weariness. Her honor chain held only a handful of medallions, as befitted her youth, yet Harina could see that no fewer than 3 commended
And that
acts
means
of
I have to
great
get a
courage.
headset,
I am
which I don't
Sumaila
have.
din Salon Long Eyes,
So,
shipmistress,
yeah, I'd
she
rather
said
not do a
hoarsely.
panel.
Sail mistress of the Darter Wind Racer. I sailed as fast as I could, but I fear it is too late for anything to be done. I stopped at every island between Tremalking and here, but I was always too late. Tears began to trickle down her cheeks, yet she seemed unaware of them. Tell the first 12 your sad news in your own way, at your own pace, Zaida said gently. Amelia, give her wine. Not gently said at all. The Aes Sedai leaped to obey. Almost 3 weeks ago, Sumaila said, Amayar on Tremalkin began asking the gift of
Cool.
passage to every island. Always a man and a woman to each island. Those who asked for Isla Somera requested they be put off in boats out of sight of land when they were told that the Shanshan holds all of Somera. She took a full goblet from Amelia.
I like it
nodding
because it's
her
something
thanks,
I did
then drank
anyways. Before I went to
Harina
bed,
exchanged
I'd
questioning
have my
glances with
audiobook
Morayo,
going and
who shook her head
be
slightly.
smoking
No Amayar
to
had ever
relax
requested
and
the gift of
fucking
passage
room
in
off.
Harina's memory,
To
though for them it truly was a gift,
just
with
pretty much
no
just
gift
relax
expected
and
in return. And they
to
avoided
help
the
me
salt,
sleep, and
keeping their
I
small
figured
fishing
I'd do a
boats
live
close
with
to
it, and
shore. So asking to be
it
put
helps,
off
I
out of
guess.
sight of land was as strange as asking passage. But what could be so dire in this? All of the Amayar in the ports left, even those owed
This
money
is a
from the
tablet
shipyards
I'm
or the
using.
rope walks. But no one thought anything of it for 2 or 3 days. The wine had not wet Samela's throat enough to mitigate her hoarseness. She scrubbed at the tears on her cheeks with the back of her hand. Not until we realized none had come back. The governor sent people to the Amayar villages. And they found, she squeezed her
Then
eyes shut.
even after this,
The Amayar were all dead or dying. Men,
it's a little
women,
tiny moth.
children. Funeral keening rose in the cabin, and Harina was surprised to realize that shrill sound
And
was
it's
coming
just
from
that
the
one
north,
that
too.
keeps bugging.
Sad enough to make an anchor weep. This should make
Then
the
even after
heavens
this,
sob.
when I end my
No wonder the
life,
sail mistress was hoarse.
Space Miner,
How
I
many
stopped the
days
book,
had she cried since
the one
learning
we're
of this
listening to,
catastrophe?
and then I'll put
How?
on the one I'm
Polana
listening to
demanded when the keening
before
died.
while I lay down.
Face distraught, she leaned forward in her chair.
And
She was holding her scent
when I
box
start my
to her
life
nose
up
as
again
if the
tomorrow,
scent could somehow ward off the
it
stench of the
starts the
disease.
book off pretty much right where
Some
we left off.
sickness? Speak, woman. Poison, wave, mistress.
What's the moth's
Samira
name?
replied. She
It's about to
struggled
be
compose
dead moth
herself,
as
but
soon as I
tears
get
still
hold
leaked
of it.
down her face. Everywhere I have been, it was the same. They gave their children a poison that put them into a deep sleep from which they did not waken. It seems there was not enough of that to go around. So many of the adults took slower poison. Some lived long enough to be found and tell the tale. The great hand on Tremalking melted. The hill where it stood reportedly is now a deep hollow. It seems the Amayar had prophecies that spoke of the hand, and when it was destroyed, they believed this signaled the end of time, what they called the end of illusion. They believed it was time for them to leave this illusion. She laughed the word bitterly. We call the world. Have none been saved? Zaida asked. None at all? Tears glistened on her cheeks, too, but Harina could not fault her on that. Her own cheeks were wet. None, shipmistress. Zaida stood, and tears or no tears, she held the aura of command.
Oh, I will, Space Miner. I've been doing it for
the fastest
a good
ships
little minute.
Must be sent to every island, even to those of Isla Somera. A way must be found.
It's slow, but it's
when the salt first
slowly
stilled
picking
after
up.
the breaking, the Amayar asked our protection from
And
brigands
then during the
raiders,
day, sometimes I
and we owe
do
them protection still.
a live
If we can
stream
find
of
only a handful
me
who
doing
still
my
live, we still
diamond
owe it.
art.
This is as sad a story as I've ever heard. Loghain's voice sounded too loud as he walked back out in front of Zaida. But your ships are committed to Bandar Eben. If you don't have enough rakers, then you must use your other fast ships too. All of them, if necessary. Are you mad? As well as heartless? Zaida demanded. Fists on her hips and feet apart, she seemed to be standing on a quarterdeck. Her glare stabbed at Loghain. We must mourn. We must save who we can, and mourn for the countless thousands we cannot save. She might as well have smiled for all the effect her glares had on Loghain. As he spoke, it seemed to Harina that the space turned chill and the light dimmed. She was not the only woman to hug herself against that cold. Mourn if you must, he said, but mourn on the march for Tarmangaiden. Chapter 23. Call to a Sitting. With Magla and Salita out for the morning, Ramonda
Sometimes
had
the hard
patched
part
Brian
is
Kent to herself, a blessed opportunity to read.
picking what book
Those
to play
two
next.
mismatched brass lamps on the small table gave off a faint yet nose-wrinkling scent of rancid oil. One had to live with such things these days. Some might consider the flame, the blade, and the heart unseemly for one of her attainments and position. As a girl in Farmading, she had been forbidden such books, but it made an agreeable change from dry histories and terrifying reports of food spoilage. She had seen a side of beef kept for months as fresh as the day the cow was slaughtered, but now the keepings were failing one by
Yeah,
one.
some of those were pretty
Some
good.
have taken to muttering that there must be a flaw in Egwene's creation, yet that was arrant blather. If a weave worked once, then properly done it always worked, barring something to disrupt the weave, and Egwene's new weaves always worked as claimed.
The good
She
thing
had to
about
give the
these
woman
books
that.
right here that I'm
And
playing,
try as they might,
right,
and
Louis
they had
Lamar.
tried very hard,
I
no
like
one
Louis
could
Lamar
detect any
because
interference. It was
a
as
lot
if
of his
Saidar
shit
itself
took
were
place
failing.
around
It was unthinkable and
this area.
inescapable. Worst of all, no one could think of anything to do. She certainly could not. A brief interlude with tales of romance and adventure was much preferable to contemplating utter futility and the failure of what was, by its very nature, unfailing. The novice straightening the tent had sense enough not to comment on her reading, or to glance at the wood-bound book twice. Bodewin Cawthon was quite pretty, but she was an intelligent girl even so, though she had something of her brother around the eyes, and rather more of him in her head than she was willing to admit. Undoubtedly, she was already hard on the path to the green, or perhaps the blue. The girl wanted to live adventure, not just read about it, as if an Aes Sedai's life would not bring her more adventure than she wished without searching for it. Ramonda felt no regret over the girl's
You
path.
almost got it.
The Yellow would have plenty to choose from among more suitable novices. There could be no question of accepting any of the older women, of course, yet that left a wealth of choice. She tried to focus on the page. She did enjoy the story of Birgitta and Geidel Kane. The tent was not particularly large, and was quite crowded. It held a trio of hard canvas cots, barely softened by thin mattresses stuffed with lumpy wool, 3 ladder-back chairs made by distinctly different hands, a rickety washstand with a cracked mirror and a chipped blue pitcher standing in the white basin, and along the table, made steady by a small block of wood under one leg, brass-bound chests for clothing, bed linens, and personal possessions. As a sitter, she could have had the space to herself, but she liked being able to keep a close eye on Magla and Salita. Just because they all sat for the Yellow was no reason to trust too far. Magla supposedly was her ally in the hall, yet went her own way much too often, and Salita seldom did anything else. Still, it made for inconvenience aside from crowding. Bodewin had a great deal of work, mainly putting away the dresses and slippers Salita scattered across the tattered carpets after deciding they would not do. That woman was frivolous enough for a green. She went through her entire wardrobe
Oh,
every
shit.
single morning. Likely she thought Ramonda would have her serving woman straightened. She always seemed to think Aelmara was as much in her service as Ramonda's. But Aelmara had served Ramonda for years before she went into retirement, not to mention helping her escape Far Madding after a slight misunderstanding a short time later. There was no possibility she would require Aelmara to look after another sister as well as herself. She frowned at the book, not seeing a word. Why in the light had Magla insisted on Salita back in Saladar? In truth, Magla had bandied several names about, each more ridiculous than the last, but had settled on Salita once she decided the plump Tyran had the best chance of being raised to a chair. Ramonda had thrown her own support behind Dagdara, a far more suitable candidate, not to mention one she thought she could sway without too much difficulty. Yet she herself had been trying for a chair while Magla already held one. That carried weight. And no matter that Ramonda had previously held a chair longer than anyone in living memory. Well, it was done, and that was that. What could not be cured must be endured. Nisao ducked into the tent, the light of Sidar around her winking out as she did so. In the brief instant before the tent flap fell shut, Saren, her bald-headed stump of a warder, was visible outside, a hand resting on his sword hilt, and his head swiveling, plainly standing guard. "May I speak with you alone?" the diminutive sister said. Short enough to make Saren seem tall, she always minded Ramonda of a large-eyed sparrow. There was nothing tiny about her powers of observation or her intellect, however. She had been a natural choice for the council the Ajahs created to try keeping an eye on Egwene, and it was certainly no fault of hers that said council had had little or no restraining effect on the woman. "Of course, Nisao." Ramonda casually closed the book and eased up to tuck it beneath the yellow-tasseled cushion on her chair. It would never do to have word get around that she was reading that. "It must be almost time for your next class, Bodewin. You don't want to be late." "Oh no, Aes Sedai. Sharina would be very upset." Spreading her white skirts in a deep curtsy, the novice darted from the tent. Ramonda compressed her lips. Sharina would be upset.
I may have to look
That
into
word
that
was
one.
emblematic of all that was wrong with allowing those above 18 into the novice ranks. Her potential was beyond incredible, but that was beside the point. Sharina Malloy was a disruption. But how to be rid of her? Her and all the other women too old to have had their names written in the novice book in the first place. provisions were strictly limited for putting a woman out once her name was in the book. Unfortunately, over the years, a number of women had been found to have lied about their age to gain entrance to the tower. By a few years only in most cases, but allowing them to remain had set precedents, and Egwene Alvear had set another, and much worse. There had to be some way to overcome it. "May I make us private?" Nisal asked. "If you wish. Have you learned something about the negotiations?" Despite Egwene's capture, talks continued under the pavilion at the foot of the bridge in Darine, or rather, the semblance of talks. They were a farce, a dumb show of obstinacy, yet it was necessary to keep a close eye on the negotiators. Varilyn had snatched most of that work to herself, claiming Grey Aja prerogative. But Magla found ways to wriggle into the matter whenever she could, and so did Saroya and Takima and Faisella. Worse than the fact that none of them seemed to trust the others to carry out the negotiations, or much at all, for that matter. At times, all of them almost seemed to be negotiating for Elida. Well, perhaps it was not that bad. They held fast against the woman's ridiculous demand that the Blue Aja be dissolved, and argued, if not nearly with sufficient force, for Elida stepping down. But if she and Lilane, she was forced to admit, did not stiffen their backbones now and then, they might well accede to some of Elida's other odious conditions. Light. At times
That's
it
too
was as if
slow
they
on
had
that
forgotten
one.
the entire purpose of marching on Tarvalon. "Pour us tea," she went on, gesturing to a painted wooden tray sitting atop two stacked chests that held a silver pitcher and several battered pewter cups. "And tell me what you've heard." The glow surrounded Nisao briefly while she warded the tent and tied off the weave. "I know nothing of the negotiations," she said, filling two of the cups. "I want to ask you to speak to Lilane." Ramonda took the proffered cup and used taking a slow swallow to give herself time for thought. At least this tea had not yet turned. Lilane? What could there be about Lilane that required warding? Still, anything that gave her leverage against the other woman would be useful. Lilane seemed entirely too smug of late for her to be entirely comfortable about it. She shifted on the seat cushion. "Regarding what? Why don't you speak to her yourself? We haven't fallen as low as it seems the White Tower has under Elida." "I have spoken to her. Or rather, she has spoken to me, and rather forcefully." Nisao sat down and set her cup on the table while she arranged her yellow-slashed skirts with overly elaborate care. She wore a small frown. It seemed she was fiddling for time, too. "Lilane demanded that I stop asking questions about Anaya and Chiron," she said finally. "According to her, their murders are Blue Aja business." Ramonda snorted, shifting again. The book's wooden cover was a hard lump beneath her, its corners digging into her hip. "That is utter nonsense. But why were you asking questions? I don't recall you being inquisitive about such matters." The other woman touched her cup to her lips, but if she drank, it was the tiniest sip. Lowering the cup, she almost seemed to grow taller. She sat up so straight. A sparrow becoming a hawk. "Because the mother ordered me to." Ramonda kept her eyebrows from rising only with an effort. "So." In the beginning, she had accepted Egwene for the same reason she suspected every other sitter had. Certainly Lilane had done so, once she realized she could not attain the stolen staff herself. A malleable young girl would be a puppet in the hands of the Hall, and Ramonda had fully intended to be the one pulling her strings. Later it had
Hell
seemed
yeah,
obvious
Space
that
Miner.
Swan was the true puppeteer, and there had been no way to stop her short of rebelling against a second Amerlin, which surely would have shattered the rebellion against Elida. She hoped Lilane had ground her teeth over that half as much as she had. Now Egwene was in Elida's hands, yet in several meetings she had remained cool and collected, determined in her course of action and that of the sisters outside Tarvalon's walls. Ramonda found in herself a grudging respect for the girl. Very grudging, but she could not deny it. It had to be Egwene herself. The Hall kept a tight fist on the dream ter'angreal, and though no one could find the one Lyanna had been loaned before that dire night, she and Swan had been practically at one another's throats. There was no question of Swan slipping into Tel Riad to tell the woman what to say. Was it possible that Nisao had come to the same conclusion about Egwene without seeing her in the unseen world? That counsel had stuck very close to her. That is reason enough for you, Nisao? She could hardly slip the book back out without the other woman noticing. She shifted again, but there was no comfortable position on the thing. She was going to have a bruise if this continued. Nisao twisted her pewter cup about on the tabletop, but she still did not look away. It is my major reason. In the beginning, I thought she would end up as your pet, or Lelane's. Later, when it was clear she had evaded both of you, I thought Swan must be holding the leash. But I soon learned I was wrong. Swan has been a teacher, I'm sure, and an advisor, and perhaps even a friend. But I've seen Egwene call her up short. No one has a leash on Egwene Alvear. She is intelligent, observant, quick to learn, and deft. She may become one of the great Amyrlin. The bird-like sister gave a sudden brief laugh. Do you realize? She will be the longest-sitting Amyrlin in history. No one will ever live long enough to top her, unless she chooses to step down early. Smiles faded to solemnity, and perhaps worry. Not because she had skirted the edge of violating custom, however. Nisao schooled her face well, but her eyes were tight. If we managed to unseat Elida, that is. Hearing her own thoughts thrown back at her with inundations was unnerving. A great Amyrlin? Well, it would take many years to see whether that came about. But whether or not Egwene managed that considerable and she would discover that the hall was much less amenable once her war powers expired. Romantic Cassid certainly would be. Respect was one thing, becoming a lapdog quite another. Standing on the pretext of straightening her deep yellow skirts, she drew the book from beneath the cushion as she sat back down and tried to drop it surreptitiously. It hit the carpet with a thud, and Nisao's eyebrows twitched. Ramonda ignored that, pulling the book under the edge of the table with her foot. We will. She put more confidence than she felt into that. The peculiar negotiations and Egwene's continuing imprisonment gave her pause. Forget the girl's claims that she could undermine Elida from within. Though it seemed half her work had been done by others, if her reporting on the situation in the tower was accurate. But Ramonda believed because she had to believe. She had no intention of living cut off from her Arja, accepting penance until Elida thought her fit to be fully Aes Sedai again. No intention of accepting Elida Aroyhan as Amyrlin. Better Lelaine than that. And one argument in her own mind for raising Egwene had been that it kept the stolen staff from Lelaine. No doubt Lelaine had thought the same concerning her. And I will inform Lelaine in no uncertain terms that you can ask any questions you wish. We must solve those murders, and the murder of any sister is every sister's concern. What have you learned so far? Not a proper question, perhaps, but being a sitter gave you certain privileges. At least, she had always believed it did. Nisao displayed no pique at being questioned, no hesitation in answering. Very little, I fear, she said ruefully, frowning at her wine cup. It seemed there must be some link between Anaya and Chiron, some reason they two were picked out. But all I've learned so far is that they had been close friends for many years. Blues called them and another blue sister, Cabriana McCandis, the Three, because they were so close. But they were all close-mouthed, too. No one recalls any of them talking about their own affairs, except with each other. In any event, friendship seems a feeble motive for murder. I hope I can find some reason why anyone would want to murder them, especially a man who can channel, but I confess it's a small hope. Ramonda furrowed her brow. Cabriana McCandis. She paid little attention to the other Ajahs. Only the yellow had any truly useful function. How could any of their passions compare to healing? Yet that name chimed a small gong in the back of her head. Why? It would come to her, or not. It could not be important. Small hopes can grow surprising fruit, Nisao. That's an old saying in farm adding, and it's true. Continue your investigation. In Egwene's absence, you may report what you learn to me. Nisao blinked, and her jaw tightened briefly. But whether or not reporting to Ramonda sat well with her, there was little she could do but obey. She could hardly claim interference in her affairs. Murder could not be one sister's affair. Besides, Magla might have gotten her ridiculous choice for the third yellow sitter, yet Ramonda had secured the position of first weaver for herself easily. After all, she'd been head of the yellow
Right.
before she retired.
That is
And
crazy.
even Magla had been unwilling to stand against her. The position
You're
carried much
sitting there
less power
smoking with
than she would
someone
have liked,
like we are now.
but at least she could count
They
on
could be
obedience in most
anywhere around
things.
the world.
From yellow sisters, if not sitters at least. As Nisao untied her ward against eavesdropping and let it dissipate, Theodrin popped into the tent. She was wearing her shawl spread across her shoulders and down her arms to display the long fringe, as newly raised sisters often did. The willowy Damani had chosen brown after Egwene granted her that shawl, but the brown had not known what to do with her, despite finally accepting her. They'd seemed ready to largely ignore her, entirely the wrong thing, so Ramonda had taken her in. Theodrin tried to behave as if she really were Aes Sedai, yet she was a bright, level-headed girl for all that. She spread her brown woolen skirts in a curtsy. A small curtsy, but a curtsy. She was well aware that she had no right to the shawl until she had been tested and passed. It would have been cruel not to make sure she understood. Lelaine has called the sitting of the hall, she said
Nice sports
breathlessly.
talk.
I couldn't find out why. I ran to tell you, but I didn't want to intrude while the ward was up. And rightly not, Ramonda said. Nisao, if you will excuse me, I must see what Lelaine is about. Gathering her yellow-fringed shawl from atop one of the chests
Nice.
holding her clothing, she arranged it over her arms and checked her hair in the cracked mirror before herding the others outside and seeing them on their way. It was not so much that she thought Nisao would have looked for what had made that thud if left in the tent alone, and she was
Nice.
certain Theodrin would not. But it was better to take no chances. Aelmara would replace the book where it belonged, with several similar volumes in the chest that held Ramonda's personal possessions. That had a very stout lock with only 2 keys, one kept in her belt pouch, the other in Aelmara's. The morning was crisp, yet spring had arrived with a rush. The dark clouds massing behind Dragon Mount's shattered peak would deliver rain rather than snow, though not on the camp, it was to be hoped. Many of the tents leaked, and the camp streets were a bog already. Horse carts making deliveries splashed mud from their high wheels as they made new ruts, driven by women.
Sports
for the most
talk. I'm
part, and a
already
few gray-haired
subscribed,
men.
dude.
Male
I've
access
been
to the Aes Sedai
subscribed.
camp was strictly limited now. Even so, nearly every sister she saw glided along the uneven wooden walkways wrapped in the light of Saidar, and followed by her warder if she had one. Ramonda refused to embrace the source whenever she went outside. She had to set an example of proper behavior, with every sister in the camp on tenterhooks, yet she was very conscious of the lack. Conscious of the lack of a warder, too. Keeping most men out of the camp was all very well, but a murderer was unlikely to pay any heed to the restriction. Down the street, Gareth Bryn rode out of a crossing street, a stocky man with mostly gray hair, his breastplate strapped over a buff-colored coat and his helmet hanging from his saddle-bow. Swan was with him, swaying on a plump, shaggy mare and looking such a pretty girl that it was almost possible to forget she had been hard-bitten and sharp-tongued as Amerlin. Easy to forget she was still an accomplished schemer, blues always were.
I don't
The
know.
mare plodded along, but Swan nearly fell off before Bryn reached out to steady her. At the edge of the blue quarters, the camp was laid out in rough approximation of the Aja quarters in the tower. He dismounted long enough to help her down, then climbed back into his baize saddle and left her standing there, holding the mare's reins and gazing after him. Now, why would she do that? Blacking the man's boots, doing his laundry. That relationship was abhorrent. The Blue should put an end to it, and to the pit of doom with custom. However strong, custom should not be abused to hold all Aes Sedai up to ridicule. Turning her back on Swan, she started toward the pavilion that served as their temporary hall of the tower. As pleasant as it was to meet in the true hall, not to mention under Elida's very nose, few sisters could manage to put themselves to sleep at any hour, so the pavilion must continue to serve. She glided along the walkway without haste. She was not about to be seen hurrying to answer Lelane's call. What could the woman want now? A gong sounded, magnified with the power, so it carried across the camp clearly, another of Sharina's suggestions, and suddenly the walkways were crowded with novices hurrying to their next class or to chores, all clustered by family. Those families of 6 or 7 always attended class together, did chores together, in fact did everything together. It was an effective way to manage so many novices. Nearly 50 more had wandered into the camp in just the last 2 weeks, pushing the total back near 1,000 in spite of runaways, and almost a quarter of those were young enough to be proper novices, more than the tower had held in centuries. Yet she wished it were not Sharina's work. The woman had not even suggested it to the mistress of novices. She had organized the thing herself and presented it to Tiana whole and complete. The novices, some of them graying or with lines in their faces, so that it was difficult to think of them as children, despite their white dresses, squeezed to the edge of the walkway to let sisters pass while they offered curtsies, but none stepped into the muddy street to make more room. Sharina, again. Sharina had spread the word that she did not want to see the girls dirtying their nice white woolens unnecessarily. It was enough to make Ramonda grind her teeth. The novices who curtsied to her straightened hurriedly and practically ran. Ahead of her, she spotted Sharina herself, talking to Tiana, who was shrouded in the glow of Sidar, doing all of the talking, with Tiana merely nodding now and then. There was nothing disrespectful in Sharina's demeanor, but despite novice white, with her creased face and gray hair and a tight bun on the back of her head, she looked exactly what she was, a grandmother. And Tiana had an unfortunately youthful appearance. Something about her bone structure and large brown eyes overwhelmed the ageless look of Aes Sedai. Lack of disrespect or no, there was too much appearance of a woman instructing her granddaughter to suit Ramonda. As she approached them, Sharina offered a proper curtsy, a very proper curtsy, Ramonda had to admit, and hurried off the other way to join her own family, waiting for her. Were there fewer lines in her face than there had been? Well, there was no saying what might happen when a woman began with the power at her age. 67, and a novice. Is she giving you difficulties? She asked, and Tiana leaped as though an icicle had slid down the back of her dress. The woman lacked the dignity, the gravity necessary in a mistress of novices. At times she seemed smothered by the number of her charges, too, and she was much too lenient besides, accepting excuses where there could be none.
Now I'm trying to remember what pizza place I was talking about.
Ramonda, though she smoothed her dark gray skirts unnecessarily. Difficulties? Of course not. Sharina
Oh yeah, sure. Why not?
Truth to tell, most are well behaved. The greatest number sent to my study are mothers upset because their daughters are learning faster than they, or have a higher potential, or aunts with the same complaint of nieces. They seem to believe the matter can be rectified somehow. They can be surprisingly adamant about it until I set them straight about being adamant with any sister.
Oh, pizza buffet beer.
More than once,
oh yeah, I forgot about that Pizza Inn.
A handful still seem surprised.
I always forget that Pizza Inn had a...
Is that so? Ramonda said absently.
It was Pizza Inn.
Her eye had caught pale-haired Delana hurrying in the same direction.
I always forget that they do beer there too.
And her so-called secretary striding at her side. Delana wore an almost somber dark gray, but the Saranoff trollop was in blue/green silk that left half her bosom on display and fit much too snugly over hips that she rolled blatantly. Of late, the pair of them seemed to have abandoned the story that Halima was merely Delana's
It's funny, that's not too far from
while Delana merely
from where the house is either.
It was always a mistake to choose a pillow friend who did not wear the shawl. especially if he were fool enough
There's
to let
actually
her
a
take
place that's at
Sharina
least
isn't only well behaved, Tiana continued blithely.
closer
She is
to
showing a great skill with Nynaeve's new way
our
of healing,
house over
like a
here,
number of the older
and
novices.
it's a
Most were
brewery
village
that they
wiseherders
have
of one
here.
sort or another. Though I don't see
So
how
it's
that
a
can
lot,
have
a
any
lot
difference.
of
One was a
local
noble
type
when you're
of different brews and different
Ramonda
types
tripped
of
over
beer
her
and
own
whatnot.
heel and staggered
But
two
they also
paces,
do
arms flailing for balance before she
pizza.
could catch
Usually
herself
comes
and gather
out
her
thin,
shawl.
but it's usually pizza
Tiana
that's
put a hand on her arm to
cooked in
steady
one of
her,
those
murmuring about the unevenness
pizza
of the
ovens that turn
planking,
around
but
and
she shook it
shit.
off.
But they have, we
Sharina
can
had
order
a
like
gift for the new
pizza
healing,
like that,
and a number of the older women.
sub sandwiches, those
She herself
sandwiches
had
that
learned
are
the new way.
toasted and
But while it was
smushed.
different enough from the old that the second learned weave limitation seemed not to apply, she had no great gift for it. Not nearly what she had for the old method. And why are novices
Never mind, I was
being
gonna show
allowed
you
to
the
practice
hat,
that, Tiana?
but it fell down way the hell back
Tiana
there.
flushed, as well she should. Such weaves were much too complex for novices, not to mention dangerous if misapplied. Done improperly, healing could kill rather than cure. The woman channeling as well as the patient. I can
I
hardly
have no
stop
idea
them
on
from
that
seeing
sports
healing
talk.
done, Ramonda, she said
I've never heard
defensively,
none of his
moving
stuff,
her
and
arms as if adjusting a shawl she was not wearing.
not my type of
There are
music I
always
listen
broken
to.
bones or some fool who's managed to cut himself badly, not to mention all the illness we've had to deal with lately. Most of the older women only have to see a weave once to have it down. Abruptly, for a bare instant, red returned to her cheeks. Smoothing her face, she drew herself up, and defensiveness fell away from her voice. In any event, Ramonda,
I don't
I
know,
shouldn't
dude.
need to
Again,
remind
that's something
you
I
that the
pay
novices
attention
and
to.
accepted are mine. As mistress of novices, I decide what they can learn and when. Some of those women could test for accepted today after only months, when it comes to the power at least.
Cool.
If I
I've
choose
never
not
heard
to
neither
make
one
them
of their
twiddle their
music,
thumbs
so
idly, it is my decision to make. Perhaps you should
I don't know
run
what to
see
tell you
whether
on that.
Sharina has any further instructions for you.
Uh,
Ramonda
like
said
I
coldly,
said, I don't listen to either one,
spots of
so
crimson staining her cheeks.
I could care
Tiana
less on
turned on
either
her
one of
heel
them
and strode
dudes.
away without another word. Not quite forbidden rudeness, but close. Even from behind, she was the image of indignation, her back stiff as an iron rod, her steps quick. Well, Ramonda was willing to admit she had come near rudeness herself, but with cause. Trying to put the mistress of novices out of her mind, she set out toward the pavilion again, but had to restrain herself to keep from walking as fast as Tiana. Sharina. And several of the other older women. Should she rethink her position? No, of course not. Their names should never have been allowed in the novice book in the first place. Yet their names were
Okay.
there, and it seemed they had mastered this wonderful new healing. Oh, it was a tangled snarl. She did not want to think about it. Not now. The pavilion stood at the heart of the camp, a much patched piece of heavy canvas surrounded by a walkway 3 times as wide as any of the others. Holding her
Hell
skirts
yeah,
well up out of the
Space
mud,
Miner, you have a
she
good
held
one.
across to it.
Oh no, I
She did
have
not mind
forgotten.
haste when it got her out of the mud.
I definitely gotta remember when I get up
Even
tomorrow
so, Elmara would have a time cleaning her shoes.
to
And
message
her
my mom.
petticoats, she thought, as she let her skirts down, decently concealing her ankles once more.
Probably
Part of the
not.
hall sitting always drew sisters hoping for news of the negotiations or of Egwene, and a good 50 or more were already gathered around the pavilion with their warders, or standing just inside, behind where their sitters would sit. Even
Yep,
here,
it's Mother's
most
Day.
shone with the light of the power, as if they were in any danger, surrounded by other Aes Sedai. She found herself with a strong urge to walk around the pavilion, boxing ears. That was impossible, of course. Even if custom could be set aside, which she had no desire to do, a chair in the hall gave no authority for such a thing.
Give me 1 second
Shiriam,
and
the
I'll be
narrow gray
right
stole
back.
of the keeper vivid on her shoulders, stood out in the crowd, in part because there was a clear space around her. Other sisters were avoiding looking at her, much less approaching her. The flame-haired woman embarrassed many of the sisters, appearing every time the hall was called to sit, as she did. The law was quite clear. Any sister could attend the sitting of the hall unless it was closed, yet the Amyrlin could not enter the hall of the tower without being announced by the keeper. and the keeper was not allowed in without the Amyrlin. Shiriam's green eyes were tight, as usual, and she fidgeted in an unbecoming manner, like a novice who knew she was due another visit to the mistress of novices. At least she was not embracing the sort, and her warder was nowhere in sight. Before stepping beneath the pavilion, Ramonda glanced over her shoulder and sighed. The great bulk of black clouds behind Dragonmount was gone, not drifting apart, simply gone entirely. Very likely there would be another wave of panic among the grooms and laborers and the serving women. Surprisingly, the novices seemed to take these strange occurrences more in stride. Perhaps that was because they were trying to take their cues from the sisters. But she suspected Sharina's hand again. What was she to do about the woman? Inside, 18 cloth-covered boxes, colored for the 6 Ajas represented in the camp, made platforms for polished benches, 2 slanting rows atop the layered carpets, widening toward a box covered with stripes in all 7 colors. Wisely, Egwene had insisted on including red, despite considerable opposition. Where Elida seemed determined to divide every Aja from every other, Egwene was determined to hold them all together, including the red. The wooden bench atop that platform had the Amyrlin's 7-striped stole laid across it. No one claimed responsibility for placing it there, but no one had removed it either. Ramonda was uncertain whether it was meant to be a reminder of Egwene Alvir, the Amyrlin's seat, an echo of her presence, or a reminder that she was absent and a prisoner. How it was seen, doubtless, depended on the sister looking. She was not the only sitter taking her time to answer Lelane's call. Delana was there, of course, slumped on her bench and rubbing the side of her nose, her watery blue eyes pensive. Once, Ramonda had considered her level-headed. Unsuitable for a chair, but level-headed. At least she had not allowed Halima to follow her into the hall and continue her harangue. Or rather, at least Halima had chosen not to. No one who had heard the woman shouting at Delana possessed any doubts who gave the orders there. Lelaine herself was already on her bench, just below the Amyrlins, a slender, hard-eyed woman in blue-slashed silk who rationed her smiles tightly, which made it doubly odd that now and then she glanced toward the 7-colored stole and gave a small smile. That smile made Ramonda uneasy, and few things could do that. Moria, in blue
go
wool
take
and
care of
bracelet
something.
silver, was striding up and down in front of the blue-covered platforms. Was her frown because she knew why Lelaine had called the hall and disapproved, or because she was worried over not knowing? "I saw Mirelle walking with Hugh," Malind said, hitching up her green-fringed shawl as Ramonda entered the pavilion. "And I don't think I've ever seen a sister looking so harassed." Despite the sympathy in her tone, her eyes sparkled and her full lips quirked with amusement. "How did you ever talk her into bonding him? I was there when someone suggested it to her, and I vow she turned pale. The man could almost pass for an Ogier. I expressed myself forcefully on duty. Faisella, stocky and square-faced, was forceful in everything. In truth, a hammer of a woman. She mocked every tale of seductive Domani. I pointed out that Hlu had been becoming more and more dangerous to himself and others since Chiron died, and I told her it couldn't be allowed to continue. I made her see that, as the only sister ever to save 2 other warders in the same circumstances, she was the only choice to try doing it again.
I don't know.
To twist her arm a little, but eventually she saw the right of the matter. How under the light could you twist Mirelle's arm? Malind leaned forward eagerly. Ramonda passed them by.
If I had the money, I probably would.
No gossip.
But just to get it trimmed up a little bit.
Bench for the brown, squinting in thought. At least she was squinting, but the woman always seemed to be thinking of something else, even when she was talking to you. Maybe her eyes were bad. The rest of the benches still stood empty, though. Ramonda wished she had been more leisurely. She would much rather have been the last to arrive than one of the first. After a moment's hesitation, she approached Lelaine. Would you care to give an idea?
I got that done.
Lelaine smiled down at her, an amused smile, yet unpleasant even so.
At a tattoo
You
convention
might as
like
well wait until we have enough sitters to proceed.
almost
I
10
don't
years
care to
ago.
repeat myself. I will tell you this much. It will be dramatic. Her eyes drifted to the striped stole, and Ramonda felt a chill. She did not let it show, however, merely taking her bench across from Lelaine. She could not help glancing uneasily at the stole herself. Was this some move to unseat Egwene? It seemed unlikely the other woman could say anything that would convince her to stand for the greater consensus. Or many of the other sitters, since that would throw them back to the struggle between her and Lelaine for control and weaken their position.
No, it didn't really hurt all that much.
Yet Lelaine's air of
It hurts.
confidence
It's
was
a little
unnerving.
sore afterwards,
She
like if you
schooled her
get your
features to
nose
calmness and
bumped
waited.
or something
There
like
was nothing
that.
else to do.
But that's
Quamesa
about
all but
it.
darted into the pavilion, her sharp-nosed face chagrined at not being first to arrive, and joined
But they're
Demont.
not very
Felita
painful.
appeared, dark and cool-eyed in yellow/green embroidered with yellow scroll work on the bosom, and suddenly there was a rush. Lirella glided in, graceful and elegant in brocaded blue silk, to take her place with the blues. Then Soroya and Eledrin with their heads together, the blocky Damani seeming almost slender alongside the stout Tarabana. As they took their places on the white benches, fox-faced
No.
Savalin joined Faecella and
Not
Lelaine,
really.
and tiny Esmeralda scurried in. Scurried? The woman was from Farmatting, too. She should know better how to behave. Verilyn is in Darine, I believe, Ramonda said as Esmeralda climbed up beside Janya. But even if some others arrive later, we have more than 11. Are you content to begin, Lelaine, or do you wish to wait? I am content to begin. Do you wish a formal sitting?
Hey, Soy, how you doing?
Lelaine smiled again. She was being very
Hope
free
you're doing
with those
good.
this morning. They did nothing to
Got a
warm
bowl
her face.
loaded,
That won't be
topped with
necessary, Ramonda. She
some
rearranged
nice
her
wax.
skirt slightly. But I ask that what is said here be sealed to the hall for the time being.
Yeah, I could take it in and
A
out.
murmur rose from the growing crowd of sisters standing behind the benches and those outside the pavilion. Even some of the sitters showed surprise. If the sitting was not formal, what need could there be to restrict knowledge of what was said so closely? Ramonda nodded as though it were the most reasonable request in the world, though. Let
It's
all
safe
depart who do
it's
not
safety
hold a
meeting
chair.
time.
Eledrin, will you make us private? Despite dark yellow hair of a silky texture and large liquid brown eyes, the Tarabonner white fell short of pretty, but she had a good head on her shoulders, which was far more important. Standing, she seemed uncertain whether she should speak the formal words, and finally contented herself with weaving the ward against eavesdropping around the pavilion and holding it. The murmuring faded as sisters and warders passed through that ward, until the last was gone, and silence fell. They stood in ranks, shoulder to shoulder on the walkway.
I take
watching,
them out.
however.
Why did you
The
take them
warders
out?
all crowded to the rear, so everyone could see.
I take it out every so often.
Adjusting her shawl,
Clean the
Lelaine
piercing
stood.
or the
A
jewelry.
green sister was
Then
brought
clear
to me when she
piercing
came
area.
asking for Egwene. The
And then
green
put it
sitters
back in.
stared, exchanging glances, no doubt wondering why the sister was not brought to them instead.
But I usually don't have to do
Lelaine
that
affected
very
not to
often.
notice.
At least
Not for the Amerlin seat.
the cleaning
For
part.
Egwene
'cause
Alvier.
like I said,
She has a
it's
proposal that meets some of our needs, though she was reluctant to say very much of it to me. Moria, will you bring her so she can present her proposal to the hall?
I've had mine pierced as long as I have.
Moria left the
But when
pavilion
we first get it done, you do have to do a lot more
to let her through.
moving
Ramonda could see
it, cleaning
sisters
it.
trying to question her, but she ignored them, disappearing across
Once
the
it
street
heals,
and into
not
the
so
blue Arja
much.
quarters. Ramonda had a dozen
Because
questions
you don't
she would
want
have
to
liked to ask in the interval.
leave
But
it out
informal
so
session or
long
not,
because
questions would have been improper at this point. The sitters did not wait in silence, however. At every Aja except the blue,
the area where it's pierced at, it heals up really quick, so you can't leave it out for longer than a day.
Selita climbed down and walked over to Ramonda's platform,
because they'll start
but Ramonda
closing
raised
up.
a hand slightly as soon as she opened her mouth. What is there to discuss?
I just remove them to clean them once in a while.
The tyrant sitter's round face was as unreadable as a stone.
Other than that, I really
but
don't
after a
take them
moment,
out.
she nodded and resumed her seat. She was not unintelligent, far from it. just unsuitable. At last, Moria returned, leading a tall woman in dark green, her dark hair pulled back severely from a stern, ivory face and held by
I
a
don't know
silver
about
comb,
that.
and everyone climbed back to their
Because
benches.
everyone knows they can pretty much
3
go
men with swords at
click
their
on
hips
it if they want
trailed
to
after
sub
her
up.
through
I
the
don't
watching
really,
sisters and into the pavilion. Unusual, that. Very
not so
unusual
much
when
into
letters had been
being
sealed
in
to the
someone's
hall.
stream and asking for it, but
Ramonda paid them little mind at first, though. She had had no real interest in warding
hey,
since her
Ozark, how
master
you doing,
died a
bro?
good many years earlier. But someone among the greens gasped, and Eledrin squeaked. She actually squeaked.
Instead of asking for it,
And
sports
she was
talk, just
staring at the warders.
throw your link down.
That had to be what they were, and not only because they were healing the greens.
How's your night
There
going,
was no
Ozark?
mistaking a warder's deadly grace. Ramonda
Not
took
too
a longer
bad,
look
just
and nearly gasped herself.
smoking a bowl of
They were disparate men,
some
alike
dank
only in the
topped
way
with
a
some
leopard
wax.
was like a lion. But one, a pretty sun-dark boy with his hair in belled braids, garbed all in black, wore a pair of pins on the tall collar of his coat, a silver sword, and a sinuous maned creature in red and gold. She had heard enough descriptions to know she was looking at an Ashaman who had been bonded, apparently. Gathering her skirts, Malind jumped down and rushed out into the crowd of sisters. Really, she was not frightened.
For one, I never did that.
Although Ramonda admitted to a hint of unease herself.
So you're hearing
if
stuff
only
wrong,
to
bro.
You are not one of us, Janya said, speaking up where she should
I don't know
not,
who's
as
telling you
always.
that, but
She leaned forward,
that was
squinting
not
at the
me.
newcome sister. Should I take it you have not come here to join us? The green's mouth twisted in obvious distaste. You take it correctly, she said in a strong Tarabonner accent. My name is Maurice Heimdall, and me I will stand with no sister who wishes to contend against other sisters while the world hangs in the balance. Our enemy, it is the shadow, not women who wear the shawl as we do. Mutters rose in the pavilion, some angry, some, Ramonda thought, shamed. If you disapprove of what we do, Janya went on, as if she had a right to speak.
Yeah,
before
but to there, Jay,
why
that
do
was
you
not
bring us
me. I
any
never
sort of
did that.
proposal? Because the dragon reborn, he asked Cadsuane, and Cadsuane, she asked me, Maurice replied.
So whoever's telling you that's lying.
The dragon reborn? The tension in the hall was suddenly palpable, but the woman continued as if she were senseless to it. Properly, it is not my proposal. Jahar, speak to them. The sun-dark youth stepped forward, and as he passed her, Maurice reached up to pat him on the shoulder encouragingly. Ramonda's respect for her rose. To bond an Ashaman was accomplishment enough. To pat one as you might a hunting hound took a level of courage
wrong,
and
'cause I never said
she
that.
herself was unsure she possessed.
Show me the video.
The boy strode
Show
to the
me
center
proof.
of the pavilion, staring at the bench where the Amerlin's stole lay, then turned about slowly, running his gaze over the sitters with an air of
You
challenge.
seen wrong.
It came to Ramonda that he was unafraid too. An Aes Sedai held his bond. He was alone and surrounded by sisters, yet if there was a scrap of fear in him, he had it under complete control. Where is Egwene Alvir? He demanded. I was ordered to lay the offer before her. Manners, Jahar.
Hey, sports talk, you need to
Maurice
quit
murmured,
doing that, bro.
and his face colored. The mother is unavailable at the moment, Ramonda said smoothly. You can tell us, and we will tell her as soon as we can. This offer comes from the Dragon Reborn?
No.
And Cadsuane. But learning what that woman was doing in company with the Dragon Reborn was secondary. Instead of answering, he snarled and spun to face Maurice. A man just tried to listen in, he said. Or maybe it was that Forsaken who killed Eben. He is right. Eledrin's voice was unsteady. At least
all right,
something touched my warding, and it wasn't.
People are entitled to their own opinions.
He's channeling? Someone said incredulously. A flurry broke out of sitters shifting on the benches, and the light of the power enveloped several. Abruptly, Delana stood. I need a breath of fresh air, she said, glowering at Jahar as though she wanted to rip his throat out. There's no need to be uneasy, Ramonda said, though she was not sure herself. But Delana, wrapped in her shawl, hurried from the pavilion. Malind passed her coming in, as did Nacella, a tall, slender Malchieri, one of the handful remaining in the tower. A good many had died in the years after Malkir fell to the shadow, letting themselves be pulled into schemes to avenge their native land, and replacements had been few and far between since.
All right, I never said
Nacella
anything
was
like
not
that, Oz.
particularly
You know me.
intelligent, but then Greens did not need intelligence, only courage. This session has been sealed to the hall, Malind, Ramonda said sharply. Nacella needs only moments, Malind replied, rubbing her hands together. Irritatingly, she did not even bother to look at Ramonda, keeping her eyes on the other Green. This is her first chance to test a new weed. Go ahead, Nacella, try it. The glow of Sidar appeared around the slim Green. Shocking! The woman neither asked permission nor told them what weave she intended, although tight strictures held on what uses of the power were allowed in the hall. Channeling all of the 5 powers, she wove around the Ashaman something that seemed akin to the weave for detecting residues, a thing Ramonda had small facility for. Nacella's blue eyes widened. He is channeling, she breathed. Or at least, holding Saidin. Ramonda's eyebrows climbed. Even Lilane gasped. Finding a man who could channel was always a matter of reading the residues of what he had done, then arduously narrowing the suspects down to the true culprit. Or rather, it had been. This was truly wondrous. Or would have been, before men who could channel started wearing black coats and strutting around openly. Still, it negated one advantage those men had always had over Aes Sedai. The Ashaman seemed not to care. His lip curled in what might have been a sneer. Can you tell what he is channeling? She asked, and disappointingly, Nacella shook her head. I thought I'd be able to, but no. On the other hand, you there, Ashaman. Extend a flow toward one of the sitters. Nothing dangerous, mind, and do not touch her. Maurice glowered at her, fists planted on her hips.
No, yeah.
Maybe Nacella failed to realize he was one of her warders. She certainly gestured at him in peremptory fashion. A stubborn cast to his eyes, Jahar opened his mouth. Do it, Jahar, Maurice said. He is mine, Nacella, but I will let you give him an order. This once. Nacella looked shocked. Apparently she had failed to realize. For the Ashaman's part, that stubborn look remained, yet he must have obeyed because Nacella clapped her hands delightedly and laughed. Soroya, she said excitedly. You extended a flow towards Soroya. The Damani White, am I right? Soroya's coppery skin paled, and gathering her white-fringed shawl around her, she hastily slid back on her bench as far as she could. For that matter, Eledrin edged away on her own bench. Tell her, Maurice said. Jahar, he can be stubborn, but he is the good boy for all that. The Damani White, Jahar agreed reluctantly. Soroya swayed as if she were going to fall over, and he glanced at her contemptuously. It was only spirit, and it's gone now. Soroya's face darkened, but whether from anger or embarrassment, there was no telling. A remarkable discovery, Lilane said. And I'm sure that Maurice will allow you to test further, Nacella, but the hall has business to conclude. I'm certain you agree, Ramonda.
Have a good one.
Managed to stop herself
what are you talking about dragging you into anything, dude?
Herself too often. If your demonstration is at an end, she said, you may withdraw, Nacella. The Malkieri Green was reluctant to go, perhaps because she could tell from Maurice's expression that there would be no further testing. Really, you would think a Green of all people would be careful with any man who might be another sister's warder. Yet she had no choice, of course. What proposal does the Dragon Reborn have for us, boy? Ramonda asked, once Nacella was on the other side of the warding. This, he said, facing her proudly. Any sister who is faithful to Egwene Alvir may bond an Ashaman to a total of 47. You cannot ask for the Dragon Reborn, nor anyone who knows the dragon, but any soldier or dedicated you ask cannot refuse. Ramonda felt as if all the blood had been squeezed from her lungs. You will agree this meets our needs, Lilane said calmly. The woman must have known the gist of it from the start. Burn her. I do, Ramonda replied. With 47 men who could channel, surely they could expand their circles as far as they would go. Perhaps even a circle that included all of them. If there were limits, they would need to be worked out. Faisella popped to her feet as if this were a formal sitting. This must be debated. I call for a formal session. I see no need for that, Ramonda told her without rising. This is much better than what we previously agreed on. There was no point in saying too much in front of the boy, or Maurice. What was her connection to the Dragon Reaper? Could she be one of the sisters, said to have sworn oaths to him? Soroya was on her feet before the last word left Ramonda's mouth. There is still the question of covenants, to be sure we are in control. We still have not agreed on those. I should think the water bond will make any other covenants moot, Lorella said dryly. Faisella rose hurriedly, and she and Soroya spoke atop one another. The taint... They stopped, staring at each other suspiciously. saidin is clean, Jahar said, though no one had addressed him. Maurice really should teach the boy how to behave, if she was going to bring him before the hall. Clean? Soroya said derisively. It has been tainted for more than 3,000 years, Faisella put in sharply. How can it be clean? Order, Ramonda snapped, trying to regain control. Order! She stared at Soroya and Faisella until they resumed their seats, then turned her attention to Maurice. Can I assume that you have linked with him? The Green simply nodded once. She really did not like her present company and did not want to say a word more than necessary. Can you say that saidin is free of the taint? The woman did not hesitate. I can. I took time to be convinced. The male half of the power, it is more alien than you can imagine. Not the inexorable yet gentle power of Saidar, but rather a raging sea of fire and ice, whipped by a tempest. Yet I am not the inexorable yet gentle power of Saidar, but rather a raging sea of fire and ice, whipped by a tempest.
Yeah, so you have a good one. And thanks for stopping by.
Convinced. It is clean. Ramonda let out a long breath, a marvel to balance some of the horrors. We are not formal, but I call the question. Who stands to accept this offer? She was on her feet as soon as she finished, but no faster than Lelaine, and Janya beat both of them. In moments, everyone was on her feet, save Soroya and Faisella. Outside the warding, heads turned as sisters doubtless began discussing what might have just been voted on. The lesser consensus standing, the offer to bond 47 Ashaman is accepted.
Sports talk.
Soroya's shoulders slumped, and Faisella exhaled heavily. She called for the greater consensus in the name of unity, but it did not surprise her when the pair remained firmly on their benches. After all, they had fought approaching the Ashaman at every turn, struggled despite law and custom to impede it even after it had been decided on. In any event, it was done, and without need of even a temporary alliance. Bonding would last a lifetime, of course, yet it was better than any sort of alliance. That implied too much equality. A peculiar number, 47, Janya mused. May I question your warder, Maurice? Thank you. How did the Dragon come to that number? A very good question. In the shock of achieving what they needed without any requirement for partnership, it had eluded her. Jahar drew himself up as if he had anticipated this, and dreaded answering. His face remained hard and cold, though. 51 sisters have been bonded by Ashaman already, and 4 of us are bonded to Aes Sedai. 47 makes the difference. There were 5 of us, but 1 died defending his Aes Sedai. Remember his name. Eben Hopwell. Remember him. There was a stunned silence. Ramonda felt a lump of ice in her middle. 51 sisters? Bonded by Ashaman? It was an abomination. Manners, Jahar, Maurice snapped. Do not make me tell you again. Shockingly, he rounded on her. They need to know, Maurice. They need to know. Turning back, he ran his gaze along the benches. His eyes seemed hot. He had been dreading nothing. He had been angry and still was. Eben was linked with his Daigyan and Beldain, with Daigyan controlling the link. So when they found themselves facing one of the Forsaken, all he could do was shout, "She's channeling Saidin," and attack her with his sword. And despite what she did to him, ruined as he was, he managed to hang on to life, hang on to Saidin long enough for Daigyan to drive her off. So you remember his name, Eben Hopwill. He fought for his Aes Sedai long after he should have been dead. When he fell silent, no one spoke until Esmeralda finally said, very quietly, "We will remember him, Jahan. But how did 51 sisters come to be bonded to Asha'man?" She leaned forward, as if his answer would be pitched as low. The boy shrugged, still angry. It was of no matter to him. Asha'man bonding Aes Sedai. Elida sent them to destroy us. The Dragon Reborn has a standing order that no Aes Sedai can be harmed unless she tries to harm one of us first. So Taim decided to capture and bomb them before they had the chance. So, they were Elida's supporters. Did that make a difference? Somehow it did, a little. But any sisters held by Asha'man brought it all back to a matter of equality, and that was intolerable. "I have another question for him, Maurice," Moria said, and waited until the green nodded. "Twice now you did speak as if a woman did channel Saidin. Why? That would be impossible." Murmurs of agreement rippled around the pavilion. "It might be impossible," the boy replied coolly, "but she did it. Daigyan told us what Eben said, and she couldn't detect anything at all, even while the woman was channeling. It had to be Saidin." Suddenly that small chime sounded again in the back of Ramonda's head, and she knew where she had heard the name Cabriana McCandis. "We must order the arrest of Dalana and Halima immediately," she said. She had to explain, of course. Not even the Amerlin seat could order the arrest of a sitter without explanation. The murders with Saidin of 2 sisters who had been close friends of Cabriana, a woman Halima had claimed friendship with as well. A female Forsaken who channeled the male half of the power. They were hardly convinced, especially Lelaine, not until a thorough search of the camp turned up no trace of either woman. They had been seen walking toward one of the traveling grounds, with Dalana and her serving woman both carrying large bundles and scurrying along behind Halima. But they were gone. Chapter 24. Honey in the Tea.
Excuse me. All right, everyone, got to call into this life for tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by, and everyone who continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Until next time, everyone, y'all stay safe out there.